In order to understand how trade between China and the United States contributed to problems associated with American consumption, we must first delve into the mechanics of exchange rates. Well, remember how we were talking about the U.S. trade deficit. Now, if China had a flexible exchange rate, the value of the yuan with respect to the dollar would change according to the market. Because less American goods are demanded, not as many people are demanding dollars, and the actual value of the dollar would start to fall, or as economists say, depreciate. And because there was a high demand for Chinese goods, there would be a high demand for the yuan, and the value of the yuan would increase, or as economists say, appreciate. The result is that the Chinese goods would become more expensive, and American goods would become cheaper. Now, in an ideal world that would follow what a macroeconomics textbook dictated, Chinese goods would become more expensive, therefore Americans would not demand as many, and as American goods became cheaper, more Chinese people would want them. Thus, the trade balance would be restored. The important thing to remember about flexible exchange rates is that it's the market that determines their value. But China had a fixed exchange rate, and with fixed exchange rates, that meant that it had a fixed value, and it was linked to a currency, in this case, the dollar. Under a fixed exchange rate, the value of the yuan does not change regardless of differences in the trade balance. The result was that Chinese goods were able to stay cheap, and more Americans bought them, thus widening the trade deficit. To better understand how a fixed exchange rate works, let's look at how individual transactions on both sides affect how the economy works. So let's take the case of an individual. Her name is Yufan, and she wants to buy an American textbook, and it's valued at $100. Now, to make things simple, let's assume that Yufan is the only one in this global economy. Because she's buying an American textbook, the United States is experiencing a trade surplus. On the other hand, China is experiencing a trade deficit. If you look at Yufan's transaction, this is how it affects the international currency market. When she buys the book, she is purchasing in yuan, but the seller in the United States won't take Chinese currency. They only take American dollars. So in this simple market, Yufan's transaction creates a demand for dollars and an oversupply of yuan. This puts upward pressure on the dollar and downward pressure on the yuan. In a flexible exchange rate, the values of these currencies would change, but in a fixed exchange rate, the Central Bank of China must maintain a fixed value of the yuan with respect to the dollar. To prevent their currency from changing in value, the central bank in China taps into its reserves of international currency. Then they buy yuan and sell dollars in the international currency market, thus satisfying the demand for dollars and oversupply of yuan. They are therefore able to maintain a fixed exchange rate in the open market. So you've seen the side where the U.S. is running a trade surplus. Let's look at the situation where it's running a trade deficit, and in that we're going to take the case of Adam. He lives in the United States, and he wants to buy these collectible Chinese dolls because he owns his own antique store, and they're valued at $100, but that's in his currency. Now with this trade situation, the United States is going to have a trade deficit, and China is going to have a trade surplus because Adam's buying China's goods. When Adam purchases these dolls, he buys them in dollars. This is how his transaction affects the international currency market. And remember, for the sake of simplicity, we're assuming Adam is the only person in this international economy. To purchase these dolls, we need yuan. This creates demand, thereby putting upward pressure on it. But we only have Adam's dollars, thus we have an oversupply of it. This puts downward pressure on the dollar. The result is that the central bank intervenes once again and purchases dollars and sells yuan on the currency market. By doing this, they're able to maintain a fixed rate. The latter situation was what was happening in China on a much larger scale. Because Americans were buying so many Chinese imports, the Chinese government needed to purchase a lot of dollars and dollar-denominated assets such as treasury bills to maintain the exchange rate. And since China's trade surplus with the United States was growing, income in China began to rise. Now, larger incomes in the United States generally translates to more spending. In China and other parts of the world, particularly Asia, people don't like to spend. They like to save their money. Why? Because in China, they don't have a strong social safety net. So Chinese people wanted to have money for emergencies like medical bills, retirement, schooling. As a result, many Chinese wanted to use their savings to buy products that could give return. And because capital restrictions had been relaxed, the Chinese were allowed to move their money anywhere they wanted, any place that could guarantee a decent return, such as the United States. In fact, they created this cycle of money, and that's the interesting thing about this whole process. Americans were buying cheap Chinese imports, and because they were buying so many, Chinese income began to increase. But as said before, because Chinese are not inclined to spend, they took that money and invested it back in the United States. So there was this cycle of Americans receiving cheap imports and then later receiving cheap Chinese capital. The result, when Treasury bills were at an all-time low of about 1%, and Freddie and Fannie were issuing mortgage-backed securities, the Chinese bought them up, thereby keeping interest rates down. So what was done with this inflow of Chinese capital? Well, it was used to finance projects such as the war in Iraq, and it was also pumped into the secondary mortgage market, which helped American families purchase homes. To review, China had a fixed exchange rate, which enabled them to keep their imports cheap. Americans bought a lot of Chinese imports. Chinese savers reinvested that money into the United States, looking for safe places to get good return. The inflow of readily available Chinese capital gave the United States easy access to money, thereby fueling the housing boom. Coming up, unraveling complicated financial products. Thanks for watching. To learn more or watch more podcasts, visit www.subprimethemusical.wordpress.com.